Hi, I'm Bill Jamison. We're going to be talking today about what New Mexico food is and how it differs from Tex-Mex cooking or Cal-Mex cooking or Az-Mex or Norteño Mexico. And we've got with us, have you ever met someone who's worked for 40 years at the same place? Pat Sharpe.
Say it so
After
badly.
graduating from college with a master's degree at about the age of 12.
Thank you for that.
She went to work for Texas Monthly Magazine and is they're very well noted and respected food critic and chronicler. Anything that Texas Monthly writes about Tex-Mex food, Pat is behind. You met Gustavo just a few minutes ago, and Carmella as well. Gustavo is from Orange County, but we'll forgive him for that today.
Please do.
And Carmella is, of course, from here from many generations back as a writer. And that was just beautiful, your art break. And has won a New Mexico Governor's Award for the arts. She's written, well, one of my favorite books on New Mexico cuisine, the Chili Chronicles. But she's also written about folk art and lowriders and all kinds of interesting New Mexico subjects. Let me introduce our topic by telling you a story. New Mexico celebrated its centennial 2 years ago in 2012, our 100 years anniversary as a part of the United States. It was not a big celebration. In fact, it was pretty puny compared to how many states celebrate their centennial. But it was 100 years. There was trepidation on both sides of the aisle when New Mexico joined the Union. A lot of politicians in the United States and a lot of just other Americans were very reluctant to bring in a state that was populated by Spanish-speaking and indigenous people. There was a lot of hostility about that. And in New Mexico, we were also very wary about losing our old traditions. There were 6 cookbooks written beginning in 1916 up to the 1940s that were written by New Mexico, distinguished New Mexico women who focused exclusively on New Mexico food. There's no period in American cookbook history where you find that kind of thing happening. Those women celebrated New Mexican cooking in all of its depth and diversity and showed how far its roots went into the past and how tied it was to our culture in New Mexico. And their purpose in writing the books was to preserve those traditions, to try to make sure that we didn't get overwhelmed by American food. We're going to talk about what this food is that they were writing about. Maybe we should start with Carmella. Would you like to talk about your experience with New Mexican food as compared to other kinds of Southwestern Mexican food?
Well, as I've read earlier, you know, my experience with New Mexican food was mostly initially at the knee of my family, various family cooks, who created dishes that were had been handed down for generations and still are, and had very definite ways about making them. But the ingredients are so many of the same ingredients that Gustavo and I were just talking about. My tia making empanaditas out of lengua, or cow tongue, you know, and they eat cow tongue in Santa Ana, and it's a shared food. Definitely, it's not necessarily New Mexican, but it's New Mexican. I would say is a really definitely a cuisine that has a lot of art influences. Definitely, the indigenous influence is so central to what we consider New Mexican food in terms of the Three Sisters, and as well as the Mexican influence of tortillas, like he was talking about. I was talking about yesterday in a panel that the Three Sisters in my family were beans, chili, and tortillas. Mm-hmm. But you know, that's actually a fusion of all these different cultures that came together in New Mexico, and where we have this long, continuous, you know, wonderfully uncut lineage of particular foods. I don't have a whole lot of experience on the cooking level. I have, other than as a home cook, in terms of really, I'm not a chef. I'm a consumer. I know what I learned from the family cooks, and actually I take their words as gospel. But so, you know, there are certain chilies that for me define New Mexican cooking, but that's not necessarily going to be the same chilies that define New Mexican cooking for somebody in southern New Mexico or even in Taos. So I think it's as much to do with cultural tradition as individual family traditions, and how we've adapted through the generations to create this particular food we call New Mexican food. But I will say, you know, Gustavo was talking about not often wanting to use the term Mexican. I think New Mexican does have a different kind of distinction in its foodways, because no, we're not making mole. We're not in this culture traditionally. We're not, or at least in my home culture. I was talking earlier about, you know, no cilantro came into my house when I was a little girl. I wasn't raised eating cilantro. But many people feel like that's a very New Mexican dish. And I didn't eat cilantro. We didn't eat a lot of oregano. And, you know, oregano and pozole you definitely didn't do that. So, you know, it's as much about individual and familial traditions as cultural traditions, I would say.
Yeah, all the different type of, basically any regional cuisine is going to be made up of the ingredients around them and the people who are using those ingredients. And that could be a little bit of everything. So in northern New Mexico, obviously you had families, Hispanos there with centuries, isolated basically from most other cultures, especially the American culture and whatnot, and only at that point tenuously connected to the rest of Mexico. So for Cal-Mex cuisine, it's interesting because you basically have what you would call Cal-Mex cuisine. In other words, the Mexican food that was eaten in Southern California, you had before 1965 and then after 1965. So before 1965, Mexican food was basically the creation of, well, it was Mexican food as seen through the prism of Protestant white Los Angeles. So it was a lot of what authentistas would call abominations. We're talking hard shell tacos from Taco Bell. We're talking the combo plate, which we ripped off from Texas, from Dallas, of course. And the biggest abomination, for me, as you know, the craziest food of them all was tamale pie. Some of you might have had tamale pie. Basically, a tamale pie was a cornmeal casserole with pork inside and some paste picante salsa, or before paste would be just what would be like Ortega's or something, and then made in a casserole. Southern California loved its tamale pie. The best chronicler of that style of Cal-Mex cuisine was the Los Angeles Times. Every year they would come out with a cookbook. First it was just an overall cookbook, but early on in 1900s, a lot of these white housewives would start sending in their recipes for Mexican food. So eventually every year the Los Angeles Times would publish like this 30-page cookbook of reader-submitted recipes. And all the tamale pies there, my Lord, it was absolutely nuts. So it was a specific type of cuisine. Were there Mexicans there in Southern California at the time? Of course, absolutely. Taquitos came from, they were first popularized from this little stall called Cielito Lindo on Olvera Street in Los Angeles. Basically, again, white Los Angeles' idealized view of a Spanish, quote unquote, Spanish Los Angeles, of the Mexicans who founded Los Angeles. And so, you try to explain that era to, say, the child of immigrants like myself, which now represents a modern day Cal-Mex cuisine, and we're just blown away. Like, oh, of course, how could you forget tamales in a can? Tamales in a can. We're actually a multi-million-dollar industry in California in the early 1900s. The first man to put tamales in a can was a man from San Francisco. His name, I can't recall, but it's in my book, obviously. But that's the cuisine of Cal-Mex. After 1965, once you started getting the great immigration waves, Mexican food changed dramatically. Oh, and before that, I'll get to that in a little bit. So after 1965, that's where you start getting the regional cuisine that I was talking about. Not just Oaxacan cuisine, but the cuisine of people from Jalisco, people from Zacatecas, people basically from all of Mexico. And more importantly, I would argue for Cal-Mex today, you started getting other immigrants, children of immigrants, who started mixing up with this Mexican food. And so you have this great smorgasbord of what passes as Mexican food now in California. So Cal-Mex cuisine now is a pastrami burrito. The pastrami burrito came from Jews living right alongside Mexicans in Boyle Heights, working class. Right before World War II, it was working class until most of the Jewish folks there moved on to the west side. But that's where you had the pastrami burrito. The Jews, they wanted Mexican food, but they also wanted their pastrami. The Mexicans loved their burritos, but they're like, hey, pastrami, we've never had this meat before. Maybe it's like carne asada. Why not? Let's try it. You have that. Earlier today, of course, we had the Korean taco. The Korean taco, no one knows exactly when it was created. It goes back to the 90s, but almost everyone agrees. I mean, I'll tell you how actually Koji, which is the taco truck that basically created modern day loncheras in the United States, it was started after the founder of Koji read a blog post by a guy, a Korean-American student who was recalling his days at UC Irvine in the early 2000s, where he had Korean students who were grilling up their kalbi and bulgogi, their Korean barbecue, and they also brought carne asada with tortillas, so they wanted to make tacos. Eventually, and this just shows how much things have changed, the first thing to run out was a carne asada, not the Korean barbecue. So these Korean students, they had all these tortillas. They're like, hey, let's start making tacos out of our Korean barbecue. So Cal-Mex cuisine now is just it's a seamless fusion of all these different cultures. What is Southern California, majority minority now, all with the common religion of Mexican food. One quick final example, then we'll turn it over to Pat. Me growing up, one of my favorite meals as, again, child of Mexican immigrants was a teriyaki bowl. And not just any teriyaki bowl. It's very specific. Teriyaki bowl, of course, classic Japanese American tradition. Eventually, though, us Mexicans in Orange County, we got a hold of it. So the modern day teriyaki bowl in Orange County, it's still white rice, and you still got the beef, but it's cut really thin like carne asada. Instead of scallions, we now put cebollitas on it, green onions. And you still put the teriyaki sauce, sure, but you mix it along with tapatio hot sauce as well. And then you wash it down with an horchata. And so there's this little chain. It was a little chain that was created in Santa Ana, the largest city in the United States with an all-Latino city council. There's like 4 of them in Orange County, and there's no Japanese Americans there. There's no white people there. It's all Mexicans eating what's now Mexican food for us, teriyaki bowls. That is Cal-Mex. That is Cal-Mex cuisine.
Well, actually, Tex-Mex has a very similar pattern to what you're describing, and I like to say that that Mexican food in Texas has become not less sort of interior with time, but more interior. So we started out, and I mean, this is through the prism of my life in Austin. So I don't pretend to speak for. Well, a little bit for Dallas and San Antonio, not for El Paso, which is like, it's its own nation. El Paso.
A glorious nation.
Used to be part of New Mexico.
Yeah. But I feel a little bit at a disadvantage because I'm coming at this not as somebody who grew up in a family, where Mexican food was being prepared, but I grew up in a family where for festive occasions, we went out for Mexican food, and we didn't call it Tex-Mex then. This was starting, say, like in the early 50s. It was Mexican food. Tex-Mex, that term did not exist. But But what it was actually what came to be known as Tex-Mex. So we would all get in the car. This is my parents and myself and my two younger brothers, and we would go to there was a big group of restaurants. It was called the Big Three for Mexican food in Austin, because they had all these ads on the radio. And so we would go to El Toro because that was our favorite, which had a big picture on the wall, and it was a Spanish bullfighter. I'm not even Mexican. It was like a Spanish bullfighter, the giant bull and the cape and, and like the outfit and everything. And we would order combination plates. But before the combination plate came, they would bring a little plastic dish of really, really watery, really pretty hot sauce. Not like anything you would see today. It was just sort of like maybe canned jalapeno chiles with a little bit of tomato and not very much else. No chips. Saltine crackers. I kid you not. Saltine crackers. And then, like on the side, they would bring, it was like a little basket with a little sombrero on top, and there would be corn tortillas, which probably they bought from a tortilla factory in Austin, which probably didn't make them with maseca. They probably made them from some masa that they had bought that had been made there, in the city, or at least in San Antonio. So we would order combination plates, and it would be refried beans, which, mashed pinto beans, not seasoned with spices that much, more sort of on the bland end, and what we call Mexican rice with a little bit of tomato, a little bit of comino. And then we have enchiladas with ground meat, because there wasn't anything else that you put in an enchilada except ground beef. And then like lots and lots of melted Longhorn cheese on top. And then what we call chili gravy. And this was sort of like a watered down version, probably made with Gebhardt's Mexican seasoning, that famous Spanish name, Gebhardt. And then if you were a light eater, you would get the señorita plate. And the señorita plate was 2 hard shell tacos, which were bought commercially, and they would have more of the ground meat on the bottom, and then chopped up iceberg lettuce and tomato on the inside, and then more finely shredded Longhorn cheese on top. Let's see, that was the señorita plate. And then there were various, like the number 1, the number 2, the number 3, like on down, probably about 6 of these. And then for dessert, there were 2 choices. It was candy or sherbet. And your waiter would come by, and he would say it was like it was one word. It wasn't candy or sherbet. It was like candy or sherbet. And so you could choose a praline. Call them pralines, not pralines. Although my mother always insisted on saying pralines. I don't know why. And it was not the chewy kind, but the crispy kind, with lots of brown sugar and pecans. Or you could get sherbet, and you get pineapple or lime or orange, and you got 1 scoop. And so that was Tex-Mex food, commercial Tex-Mex food. I'm not talking about the food that people with a real, claim on the culture ate in their homes, although I think that there were probably some similarities. I think it was much richer in the home, but this is what the, and the proprietors of these restaurants were by and large people of Mexican American heritage. I mean, they were probably, grew up in Austin. But this is what they had decided was viable, and this was what people liked, and it certainly was what the Anglo public liked, like us. And And these restaurants were enormously popular, and almost every single one was exactly the same until about 1965, give or take, when there began to be more and more Mexican immigration coming into Texas. And as that happened, well, then the whole scene began to change. And then, then we got fajitas, which people younger than me think are Tex-Mex, but, to me, fajitas are something that's like 1980, are you kidding? That's not Tex-Mex. But, I guess the point is that your definition of whatever is authentic or indigenous or real or true to your region sort of depends on where you are on the time spectrum. And, so from my little narrow point of view, like child of the 1950s, through the mid-60s, into the 70s, that was what Tex-Mex was at the time, or Mexican food as we called it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's
Well,
my story, and I'm sticking with
There's
it.
an interesting distinction, between the experiences here.
Well, I think the romanticism of the Spanish culture is really interesting because some of the and I do have Spanish ancestors.
I do too.
I know. But it's interesting because even those people who were writing the cookbooks that you're talking about in the early years, they were probably defining their food as Spanish American food. Mm-hmm. And that was very telling in the way that you're saying of the time period. It had to do with, especially Fabiola, Vaca, and those people who were writing the earliest cookbooks, they had come out of a time when it wasn't necessarily cool to claim that you were Spanish and you grew up, or Mexicano or Nuevo Mexicano, and you grew up speaking Spanish and you grew up on the farm and you grew up doing those things so that you didn't raise your kids speaking Spanish. You didn't necessarily promote your food in that context. And so when it became a point of publication, it was identified, and also in menus around town. You look at old menus from Santa Fe, old-time Santa Fe, the 20s, it's all Spanish-American food. But what is it? It's chili, it's beans, it's rice, but I wouldn't say rice was as much of a staple. It's squash. It was more the Three Sisters here.
Rice came in later.
Rice came in later. I didn't grow up eating Spanish rice.
Yeah,
what
not
they
at
call
all.
Spanish rice with tomatoes. Right. I never ate chili. I ate chili with beans, but never ate chili with tomatoes, which is what you would more consider associated maybe with a Tex-Mex chili,
Mm-hmm.
with ground beef and tomato and that kind of a different spicing. So I think it had to do with the time period. When I was growing up, we didn't really have burritos in my house so much.
Right.
We had tortillas, but my mom didn't make burritos. She made enchiladas, she made carne adobada. Those were staples. But I always wanted to go to Taco Bell. And my dad would say, walk to Taco Bell. If you're going to go to Taco Bell, go walk. Because, you thought that was the best thing. And that when you were talking about that little watery sauce that they served at Taco Bell, I thought that was so good. And, but forget what you have in your own backyard. I guess if anything defines New Mexican food for me, it's one of the defining things is the chile and the way that chili is used here. Because chili is, we use a lot of chili. I grew up in a household where you ate just bowls of chili.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't have beans in it, didn't have anything. It was a bowl of red with some pork or a bowl of green with some pork and potatoes. And sometimes you put beans, but you didn't have to. But, it's a liberal use of chili. And sometimes I know that chefs come here from elsewhere when they're studying Southwest cuisine, or they're looking at Mexican cuisine in terms of Oaxacan cuisine and other places. I travel a lot in Mexico, and I love spicy food, but chile is never used in the way that we use it here.
Right.
It's used sparingly, and it's used, but here, it's everywhere. And I would say that that's a really sort of a signature of New Mexican food.
Mm-hmm.
Well, New Mexican food does go back, as your family does, for many generations. New Mexican dishes, the ones that have stayed around for centuries. Those dishes, unlike Spanish rice, tacos came in the 20th century, mid 20th century, burritos in the mid 20th century. They came in from Texas and from Mexico. But the New Mexican foods go back for a long way, the ones that are real true favorites in the state. Gustavo mentioned that Santa Fe was very isolated. You cannot imagine how isolated Santa Fe was for 2 centuries, from 1598, when it was settled, up to 1821, when the Santa Fe Trail came in. There was no contact between, there was very limited contact with Mexico at all. It was a 6-month wagon train trip to Mexico City from Santa Fe. People just didn't do that except every 2 or 3 years. And so New Mexican food developed independently. I mean, there were influences that came up strongly from Mexico. The tortillas, the tamale, the chiles. But the chiles became the defining factor in New Mexican food. The chili sauces that were probably originally used to flavor meat dishes, mainly mutton in colonial times. They also transferred over to enchiladas and all of those other dishes that you also found in Tex-Mex cooking, Cal-Mex, and Mexican cooking.
I've got a question. So are the chilies, the New Mexican chilies, grown extensively in the state and easily accessible? Is that why they became such a dominant part of the...
Yes, there were no other spices. We did have salt, but there was little else. Mexico was favored, central Mexico, the Valley of Mexico, with an abundance of seasonings. And they became the basis of Mexican cooking in the Valley of Mexico, in Puebla, in Oaxaca, and even up to Zacatecas. Mm-hmm. But once you got beyond that area, and you got into cattle country, and then eventually into New Mexico, New Mexico was just totally isolated. And the food here did develop independently, unlike in California and Texas, which were settled 2 centuries later.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you did have a colonial connection, though, via the Camino Real. And so you did have foods coming in. I mean, you had olive oil coming into New Mexico. It might have been every 2 years.
Right, right.
You had
chocolate.
You had chocolate.
Yeah.
You had luxury European goods.
But I get your point. I get his point,
yeah.
In the sense that New Mexico was isolated. I mean, again, it didn't become a state until basically about a century ago, and it didn't get all the migration the way Texas and California did. Especially California, was basically a couple thousand people up until after the gold rush, and then you have the entire East Coast and Missouri coming in and just settling. Then you have Chinese migration. You have all these different waves of migration. New Mexico, on the other hand, only until very, very recently did you start seeing migration that would change the cuisine. That's why I think New Mexican cuisine is so magical, because it's basically the oldest regional cuisine in America, in the United States, and also in a way it's one of the oldest regional extant cuisines of Mexico. It's like our cousin who went away, and it went away and we still think of it, hey, what's going on? But that's what makes it so special. You can't say the same of Tex-Mex and Cal-Mex cuisine, but we're all related, but each one is, again, a product of its environment, and that's ultimately what makes regional cuisine the great thing that it is.
I think that's very true. I once described Tex-Mex, sort of the old Tex-Mex, as an orphan cuisine of Mexico, and I think Texas was like the farthest north. Well, I guess California, but you were the farthest west.
Sure.
And so it was the isolation and not having any connection to those ingredients that made Mexican food what it was, especially those tropical, the fruits and the chiles, this incredible variety. We just had, we didn't even have jalapenos. They were in cans until like 1965, give or take. And that was probably true, maybe to a lesser extent because California is such a great place for for growing anything.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, California has always been has always had the most connection to Mexico, at least cuisine-wise, of all the other states, with maybe the exception of Arizona. Except with Arizona, it's very specifically linked to Sonora. In fact, Arizonan cuisine and Sonoran cuisine, they're it's the same thing basically. And so in that sense, what's interesting to me, we were talking about labels earlier. There's this famous restaurant in Los Angeles called El Cholo Cafe. It's the second oldest continuously operating Mexican restaurant in the United States. The only older place is El Charro Cafe in Tucson. It beats it by like 2 years. So El Cholo goes back to like 1924 or whatever. And so they did this really good, I think one of the food critics for the LA Times, one of the writers at least in the past, he did this really good history of El Cholo Cafe. And so he has all these menus, and it's amazing to see how El Cholo would identify itself as. The very first menu called itself Spanish cuisine. Then it called itself Spanish American cuisine. Exactly. Then it called itself Sonoran cuisine because basically in those early days, anything but Mexican would do. Then around the right up until the 60s, then it started calling itself Mexican American cuisine. And now they just call it themselves Mexican cuisine, even though most of Southern California now would not think of El Cholo as Mexican food. They think of it as white people's Mexican food. It's such a relic of its time. But also you see the menu, going back to what is Cal-Mex or Tex-Mex, you see the menus and you start seeing different dishes. In the early menus of El Cholo going to the 20s, there were no burritos, there were no tacos. There were it was basically Sonoran cuisine. Flour tortillas, carne asada, chile colorado, chile verde, pork, and that's it. Tacos don't get into the menu until the 40s. Nachos actually came into the 50s because of a waitress from San Antonio named Carmen Rocha who came over and introduced a meal and made it she basically popularized nachos for the rest of the country because you had all these people more people unfortunately going to Los Angeles, and they were going to San Antonio, so much so that when she passed away, the LA Times and newspapers nationally, they said she invented nachos, which she didn't. It was an actual Mexican in Piedra Negra.
In Piedra Negra.
Exactly. Yeah. But just to show how things change, I mean, it's all right there if you just dig into that history. But meanwhile, the food, I once compared Mexican food in this country, it's like to a 7-layer bean dip. So it's all the same dish, and going to what Pat said, for some people, their idea of Mexican food, authentic Mexican food, is going to be completely different. So, past generation obviously knew the combo plate. My generation would see the combo plate as an American invention, and then the younger people now, they're seeing Korean tacos like, hey, it's something Mexican and Korean at the same time. It's quite amazing.
Well, one thing I'd say about New Mexico is it's really hard to even say you have a specific New Mexican cuisine because, as we know, there's different approaches in native communities to cuisine, and the native communities are New Mexican, part of New Mexico. If you go into southern New Mexico, it's a different story. When I was raised, of course, in what I feel is the cradle of the finest New Mexican cuisine, which is in northern New Mexico, where you had the chilies that have been grown continuously over 400 years during in the land races that actually came with the earliest expeditions and were planted and have continued to be cultivated through heirloom seeds versus cultivation of chiles that are hybrids and developed for agriculture, truly agribusiness reasons. But when I was doing the Chili Chronicles, I had was spoiled and I had an idea of what chili was like from here, and I went into southern New Mexico. And I had just one story. I remember going to Hatch, and thinking I was going to eat the best chili in the world in Hatch, and asked for the best restaurant, that was like defining Hatch chili restaurant. And they sent me to a place, and it was like a few chilies in a white sauce that was kind of like a cornstarch creamy sauce, and it was more akin to sort of a country gravy with a few pieces of chili, and there's a real relationship, I think, in parts of southern New Mexico with Texas.
Yes.
You know, because there's a lot more back and forth that way because it wasn't as far. And so if you ask somebody what New Mexican food is in southern New Mexico, it's going to be very different from what we're saying in northern New Mexico. Part of that is you might have the common thread of chili, but how chilies are used is different, and what types of chilies you use.
It's one dish or a couple of dishes. In northern New Mexico, carne adobada is king. In southern New Mexico, is chili con carne. And I think Texas actually stole chili con carne from New Mexico. I mean,
That's fighting.
this is a reasonable possibility. I mean, that dish existed back probably, you know, by the 18th century in New Mexico, the chili con carne. It was in all of the early cookbooks that were mainly written by northern New Mexico women. And it just, for some reason, does not appear on northern New Mexico restaurant menus at all. But it certainly does in the South. And Texas, of course, claimed New Mexico after they won their independence from Mexico. The maps they drew of Texas extended right up through Santa Fe to Taos. And they sent an army here.
Well, I think part of the point of all of these different cuisines is what you identify with. And so I know in New Mexico we fiercely defend our chili and how it's made and what you put in it, and at least in the family I grew up in we did. But also all these new introductions then suddenly become accommodated and become ours, the Frito pie.
Yeah, right.
So who knows? Texas claims the Frito
It's
pie.
Texas.
Absolutely.
It's
Yeah, it's Texas people.
We had this conversation last year. It was Elmer Doolin, the creator of Frito. His mom created the first Frito
But if
pie
you
recipe.
go down to Woolworth,
You guys claimed it though.
Yes,
It's a beautiful
and,
thing.
and we made it a beautiful thing. And actually, I would not consider it a traditional dish, but I make it in my home, but with really special chili and and all of that. So it's
made with New Mexico chili.
It's not with chile
here.
con carne with ground beef. So it's really interesting because you adopt things and you adapt them and then they become yours. And that's really the point of it is, there's a lot of sharing and a lot of commonality.
Fusion. Fusion is, it's a word that was invented and it's been much maligned, but really, in truth, cuisine worldwide is fusion. Unless you're landlocked, or hemmed in some way, and you can't get out, your cuisine is going to mix with others, and they're going to come in, and it's all one big melting pot, and I say hooray for that.
Yeah.
Let's get other people involved here. Comments, questions?
Yeah, can you talk about use or lack of use of cumin? Because I was always told that you did not use cumin in northern New Mexico chili.
My family did not. Very purist approach.
Yeah, I always
It never
Yeah.
appears in
Not
all the
cumin.
recipes in New Mexico.
I always had a cumin and more Texas thing.
Texas loves its cumin. To the point of, it's kind of overwhelming. But that's probably our signature spice is comino.
Yeah, no cumin, no oregano, no cilantro. And it probably actually goes back to what Lois Allen Frank yesterday was talking about, curing of meats, salt and chili. We had chili and it had salt and it had meat, and those were the ingredients. You didn't spice it up with a lot of other things. Those were where you got your main flavors. I think that those types of things have become more of a modern introduction, and now again they've become more part of it, identified with New Mexican cuisine. But if you grew up, for the most part, I know Rosemary did, and Cynthia in a northern New Mexico household, your parents didn't cook with a lot of that.
For me, New Mexican food is much simpler. It's it has salt, we had garlic in ours, but we didn't use like Carmella, and that came from Mountain Creek. And that's kind of what I like about, for me, my favorite Mexican food is New Mexican, and I love Tucson, Sonora.
Mm-hmm.
But Tex-Mex, to me, is just too much stuff, and even California, too much, it just, you can't taste the wonderful chili, you know, it just gets too garbled. So for me, I love New Mexico.
That's crazy city people.
Yeah.
if you want to play states, yeah.
Yeah.
What about the tamale in New Mexico?
Tamales are definitely integral to New Mexican cuisine. I mean, I grew up eating, again, red chili, pork, corn tamales. Now you see a lot of tamales here, calabacitas, you know, vegetarian tamales. I didn't grow up eating those. You have chicken and green chili, but I think those are more modern introductions to accommodate more modern tastes. But for the most part, it's red chili.
Yeah,
and
the
pork.
tamal is like the tamal and its different names, like I would say the one universal of Latin American cuisine. Like you could find tamales in South America, they're called humitos. You could find versions of them in Colombia, all the way down to Argentina, then here in the United States. So, you know, and tamales have been part of any sort of Mexican food from the time of the Aztecs all the way up until Texas. Like, you know, doing research for my book, one of the nicknames for San Antonio back in like the 1850s was Tamale Town. You had these Anglos coming in and just, they were more fascinated ultimately with chile con carne than they were for tamales, but eventually they also loved the tamales as well. And the first couple of companies that started making these tamales in a can were in Texas and in California. Probably the tamales least, I mean, you see it in Sonoran cooking, but not as much as there. You know, it's cattle country there, so that was always a little bit more meat. But yeah, New Mexico, and each version though has their own different styles as well.
Yeah, in Texas, the tamales were universal. Like on the combination plate, you would usually get a tamal, and it would have this pathetic, really finely ground beef, and you know, and some really soggy masa, and so they kind of sort of went out of style, you know, and it was sort of like the elongated, not the square type, and they kind of went out of style, but they hung on as a Christmas tradition, and now they've kind of come back. But in a much more, you know, a much more palatable, much more authentic, much more handmade way. And so now there's a lot of respect for tamales in Texas. And there's a company in Fort Worth called Hot Damn Tamales that ships them like all over the country, and I don't know, maybe all over the world. And you know, with like, you know, different fillings. And so it's been this kind of like a dip and then a rise again.
Yeah, I grew up 30 miles east of Los Angeles. We had the same combination plates in the 60s.
Really?
Oh yeah. No, California ripped
Yeah.
off the combo plate. I'll admit that. Our one introduction was that pointless salad that goes with all combo plates. That's the one thing California did to the
Oh,
combo.
I don't know. We've got a pointless salad too.
Really?
No, I will be second to no one in pointless salads.
But I want to ask Pat, so post-combo plate, like what does Tex-Mex food like today?
You know, it's Mex-Tex food. In fact, we did a story in the magazine, the last big sort of survey of the best Mexican restaurants in Texas. And the headline was, "Let's have Mex-Tex." And so I think it's the waves of immigrants have brought ever more authentic, you know, like, you know, mole poblano and like even mole negro and in all of these different, very, very interior dishes now are part of, I don't think we'd call those Tex-Mex. And I don't know what Tex-Mex is anymore because it's so varied. It's not easy to define like it used to be. But it's much more interior than it was. I guess you can say that.
So it's more like California.
It is,
in a
yeah.
sense, but Texas is getting the majority of its Mexicans from northern Mexico. So,
Yeah.
you know, Chihuahua, Nuevo León, Tamaulipas, we're not getting any of those. So I've traveled a lot in Texas in the past couple of years. So I always love going to see, like, eating barbacoa, of course, is I would consider it part of Tex-Mex, more of South Texas. But now you're getting cabrito, kid go, basically, and they just make it this amazing thing. There's this restaurant in Houston called, I think it's called La Macro. Have you ever been there? Macro? But it's basically a Mexican hamburger shop. So these are people from Monterrey, Nuevo León, and it's not carne adobada and it's not al pastor. They call it trompo. Basically, it's all the same thing, basically, you know. And so they make a trompo hamburger, and that's what they're eating in Monterrey, and that's been a huge hit in Texas. So or in Houston specifically. So I would call that Mex-Tex, like this combination of the new immigrants mixed in with whatever's in Texas right there.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone know the history of mole? Like, because I know they have it in South America too.
Yeah, again, it's one of those traditional meals going to before the conquest. You know, mole comes from the Nahuatl word molli, M-O-L-L-I, which is basically a sauce, and that's what they would do. Any other newer introductions, of course.
Well, you know, but also there's the story, which is undoubtedly not true, about it having been invented in 1650
By nuns.
By nuns, you know,
Mole
in
poblano.
in the convent. But you know, I mean, and those would have been nuns with a very strong Spanish heritage and tradition. But what is undoubtedly true is that there is a lot of Moorish influence, you know, like with the ground nuts, and you know, which is very, very much a part of that food tradition. And so I think that once again, it's one of those fusion things that the chiles from the New World and the ground nuts from the Spanish tradition, you know, all mixed together into, you know, something that was new and sort of unheard of.
Lots of hands.
So I want to hark back to one of the earlier keynotes talking about someone mentioned the Apaches, and I mean, maybe the Spaniards were isolated, but certainly the indigenous people were not isolated in New Mexico. So, you know, at one point in our history, Comanches held, you know, control over a lot of the territory. I'm just wondering if any of you have come across any sort of any of the influence, because they clearly share their food, or, you know, share food traditions or whatever. So they seem to have been left out of the conversation. I'd like to hear what any of you might know about their presence in this area.
Well, I was actually speaking with Patricia Crown, she's here earlier today, and you know, she's the woman who really discovered the evidence of chocolate at Chaco Canyon. And it wasn't like that was a big surprise, because the trade routes were so, you know, the native tribes here had been trading with Mexico for so long. But we were talking about the fact that to this date, it has not been shown from an archaeological standpoint that Chile was in New Mexico before the Spanish. And I find that very hard to believe, but there's no archaeological evidence to support that that is not the case. And so it's really a point of debate, and it's really, you know, those trade routes were so wide open, and there were so many different influences coming in and out, shared influences between tribes all over, you know, the Western Americas and into Mexico, that, you know, it's still, nothing is set in stone for sure. And so I think that you can't leave the indigenous peoples out of the conversation, because, you know, they definitely, you were here dealing with these foodways first, and it's a matter of having the sort of the European model of of proving what was here through excavation and archaeology. And
the same fusion of Mediterranean traditions with indigenous American traditions. I mean, it happened most profoundly in the valley of Mexico, in central Mexico, but it also happened in New Mexico with the Spanish settlers and the Puebloans and the Diné. These developed into shared traditions, and there are different styles that you find in Pueblo feast day cooking today, from a New Mexico family dinner celebration, but it's very similar food and shared.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of these words, you know, Cal-Mex, Tex-Mex, is part of the restaurant marketing. You know, because like in Austin, you were talking about, I forget, with the toro and the Spanish.
El Toro, yeah.
And then there was like El Rancho.
Yeah.
And then you could have like a menu that was American, and then on the same, you know, you open it up, so you had like an American side and a Mexican side. And then for me, seeing some of adding like the Texas burger. Rather than a 4-pound, it was a whole pound. And so then you introduce that, and then some of my friends who moved up from San Antonio, whose parents had restaurants, they would go on the drag and sell burritos out of a cart, sort of like the street, the food cart trucks now. And I think some of that became the Tex-Mex part. It was, you know, easier to get. Students could just real quickly, you didn't have to go in, you didn't have to sit down, you didn't have to be served, you didn't have to pay a tip.
Yeah.
And so in Austin, in my vision of what I saw going on, that was sort of the Tex-Mex version of, you know, not really going to a restaurant, not going to a food truck, but maybe going to a little shack. That, you know, they didn't have a big menu, and then they were giving you a choice of Mexican or Tex-Mex.
Well, I think the sort of the migration of the taco, you know, into the food truck certainly has spread it farther and wider than might have happened otherwise.
Oh yeah, I mean the taco truck was a Los Angeles invention. I mean and that goes back to tamale vendors in the 1890s. But even in the United States, you had tamale men going all across the United States in the 1900s and so on and so forth. I think the value in labels, though, is that it differentiates cuisine so that the consumer can know, like, hey, if you go to Texas, you're going to have a different style of quote-unquote Mexican food than you will in New Mexico, than you will in California. And just anytime I think you could differentiate a cuisine from its neighbors or cousins, I think you should, just because it'll give people a sense like, okay, this is something that we should go here. Almost for tourism, it is basically for labeling purposes, for promotion, but that's a good thing. That's what restaurateurs do for a living. You differentiate yourself from everyone else.
Yeah, and you market.
Yeah.
Just going on, because you're talking about restaurants, is I think a lot about, even though you talked about New Mexican food from here in the northern part of the state down to the southern part of the state varies so much, and we're talking about the way it's defined for restaurants often is supposed to help the tourist or the customer sort of know what they're getting. New Mexican food is the only place I can think of in the country where you drive down the street and you're seeing the state name as the type of food.
Huh.
It's New Mexican food. You don't see, I grew up in Oregon, there wasn't the Oregonian restaurant. It might be Tex-Mex or, now maybe in
Texas and New Mexico.
You don't see it as, oh, we're going down to the New Mexican restaurant. You know, here that's what you do, but you know, my mom didn't go down to the Pennsylvania restaurant. You know, it's the only place where it may vary all over the state, but it's very branded as that's the type of restaurant people open up. I mean, I sometimes feel like, oh, I'd like to find a Mexican restaurant, like Mexican restaurant, and it's hard to find, and that's different.
Oh,
than
it's
a
getting
Mexican
better.
restaurant. Well, it is, but it's, you know, it's sort of like, that's what we do when we go to Albuquerque. You know, you're searching out some exotic foods, you know, and whereas, oh wait, New Mexican is what I can walk to, you know, just right up the street from my house, and it's good, it's local, it's the local food. But it's one of the only places states I've been through where it's branded with the state name. It's not just a regional Southwest or Southern food, or even local like Sonoran or New Orleans or something like that.
I'd say it's branded, but I wouldn't say it's fully understood by just the everyday person walking down the street or coming as a tourist. And I think there's a lot of value in really, from a promotion standpoint, in really trying to educate people about the different influences. And so we're, you know, from the native influence to the Mexican influence to the Spanish influence to the other influences. I mean, we have this whole mythology of a tricultural state, but you know, we have so many other influences that were here so much at the same time. You have a lot of Lebanese influence in Santa Fe. You had You had a lot of early Chinese people in Santa Fe. You have a famous Greek family, extended Greek family in Santa Fe who run some of the finest New Mexican restaurants in New Mexico.
Right.
But they're of Greek origins, and so I think it really does take some education. Branding is one thing, but I think that it's still misunderstood, and I think it's if people are thumbing their nose at Mexican or Spanish or this or that, it's because they don't understand all the layers, and it really is a wonderful layering through time.
Okay, one more question or comment, and then we've got to cut it off, as the timekeeper says. Sir?
Yeah, I'd like to add a footnote to what Camelia said and her conversation with Patty Crown. I'm an ethnobotanist, and at one time we used to say Mesoamerica ended in Durango because that was the Chile line. And from Durango, southern Durango south, they had Chile. So that was Mesoamerica. North of there, we didn't have it. Within the last 3 years, Paul Minnis, who's an ethnobotanist at the University of Oklahoma, he found a single chili seed at Casas Grandes. And that's the furthest north that we have found chili yet.
Right.
Wow.
One seed.
Yeah.
One seed.
And,
Wow.
but yet at the same time,
Start.
it's very significant.
That's
I mean,
huge.
you know,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
find one, you keep looking for others, which he's been doing. He's been excavating there for over 20 years. But we're in
One chili. That is one.
That's all worth it.
Chili's creeping north. You're never sure that
Well, think.
it's outside of Pac-Man, the site that he found it where he was excavating.
No. Well, thank you very much for coming and contributing to the conversation.